Well, I started tearing into my car a little sooner than I thought I would. I wanted to be ahead of the game if I had to order some parts for it, and of course I did. I ended up needing to order a CV axle. On this car, I actually used the Cavalier transmission case fully. So I used the bell housing and the case have all Cavalier, which meant I had to cut the input shaft down for the gear set that I used. And this means I use stock length axles. And anyone that's messed with stock length axles know that aftermarket axles run short and you have to run a spacer. And my experiences with the spacer haven't all been positive. It does actually pull, it ends up running the splines on the CV axle partially out of the hub, meaning you won't get full spline engagement into the hub when you have to run that spacer. And I sheared a hub off one time, my right front hub here. The actual hub flange sheared from the part that splines over the axle, and it split right at the end of where the splines on the CV axle stopped. So whenever I can avoid having to run the axle spacers, I do, but I am actually running one on my old car back there, and it's been doing just fine. So it may have just been a fluke thing, but I do use Timken bearings, so it was kind of a shock to me that it broke that way. Anyway, on Alex's car, I knock my tools over. I run the Cavalier case half, so the part with the mounts on it, and I actually run the View bell housing. And when you run the View bell housing, you can run the View input shaft in its stock form. You don't have to cut anything. If you use View or Cobalt transmission guts inside of a Cavalier case and you use the Cavalier bell housing, you have to trim the input shaft down by, I forget the measurement. I think it's like 3/8 of an inch, or maybe a half inch, somewhere in that neighborhood. That being said, the View bell housing, if you run that and you don't cut that input shaft, it actually offsets the transmission just slightly. It moves towards the driver's side of the car. And if you have stock mounts on these cars, which I run stock mounts, now I do fill them with window weld urethane, but the engine is still somewhat pliable in the engine bay. It's not rigidly mounted. Because of that, I can run the View transmission bell housing in Alex's car without having to modify the mounts. They are pliable enough that that difference is made up. You can get all the bolts in and mount it up. When you run the View bell housing, the axle becomes even further away from the hub. So an aftermarket axle really doesn't reach. And I have found that the Saturn L200 right front axles are the perfect length for that setup. So for guys that run the View transmissions in their cars and you run the longer right front control arm, Saturn L200 axle, you shouldn't need an axle spacer and everything works great. This car, I was running an OEM axle that broke on the race Saturday, which I knocked off that rubber dampener piece that's usually on them. I currently have a stock backup axle in there right now to move the car around, but I don't want to run that in the next race. So I had to order a CV axle, and the aftermarket one that I end up with, I'm sure I'm going to have to run a axle spacer on it. But I ended up ripping the front end off the car, as you can see, to assess the damage further. And I already knew that my lower core had a bend in it, and it's really not bad. I could just run that, but I have a couple in the back. I'm going to throw it on there. I'm going to hammer my protector grate back straight again, get that thing zip tied back up. The bottom of my radiator is bent, but there are no leaks. And I have another brand new radiator in the box, but I really don't want to use it yet. So I'm just going to keep running that one. The other thing that I still have to address, which I have here, is the brake line. And when that axle came up, when it broke, right there. It gave it a smash when that axle was whipping around. And I don't believe I have any leaks. I mean, I still have a full reservoir, but the pedal feels real weird. So that's the stock routing for that brake line. And I have been exploring options on what to do with it. I don't run it along the subframe like they do in the stock setup on these cars because it makes getting the subframe out a lot easier and it removes this line from any potential risks like running over a tractor tire. And the way I end up running it up along the top of the firewall, and then it dropped down where the stock line went before, I was thinking about going through, there's a hole there in the side of the strut tower. It's a factory hole. Thought about running it out of that hole right there and coming across, but this strut is really close to the inner structure, and when you slot your struts for camber or you run the longer control arm, that spring gets closer to the inner structure, and I don't want to put that line anywhere near that action. So I think what my plan is going to be is to come down a little closer to the firewall and come through this pocket where the steering rack is. So I'll come down and I'll come up and over and then straight into the brake hose. That way, if I ever break an axle again, it can flop around all at once over there, and then this piece of the K-frame will keep that brake line from getting smashed. That's my thought process currently. I haven't thought of a better way of doing it. So I'm probably just going to stick with it and bend up this line that I bought for the job right now. I very well could just cut this line somewhere in here and then put another nut on it and flare it and then put a coupler and then run another line down to where it was damaged. But this stuff is so easy to work with. It's just easier for me to just buy the whole tube and bend it up and slap it in there. This line is a 3/16 line, 72 inches long, metric thread with a bubble flare. So that makes this an M6 by 1.0 line. This was on it says CNE 372. So that was a European line. I got this from O'Reilly. Usually if you go back and ask them if you can look at your brake lines, you can find this in the standard brake line, and then this is the NICOP stuff. You can see that it's got a bubble flare, and it said M6 by 1.0 is all of the brake fittings on a Cavalier at the wheels. So the wheel cylinders in the rear and the brake hoses in the front, M6 by 1.0 bubble flare. At the master cylinder, you've got the two lines that run off to the proportioning valve. And this is a non-ABS car. The ABS car is, I'll show you. You can see it's got this big module on the front of it. There's a big pump motor in the back of it and a big electrical connector down at the bottom of the front. And you can see I don't have mine plugged in. It works just fine unplugged. I've ran this car for years with no issues. A lot of other guys do this the same thing and it works fine. If you're concerned about cutting every ounce of weight out of a car, definitely chuck that and get the regular proportioning valve, the non-ABS. I have had one guy use an ABS block like that came out of a junkyard car that didn't have a hood on it. And we think there may have been rainwater in the reservoir at some point, but he couldn't get his brakes to bleed whatsoever. And my assumption was that there was a shuttle valve or one of the solenoid valves inside that ABS block that was stuck in one position and just couldn't get it to bleed. And he never powered it up to try and see if it would unstick itself, but it's some food for thought there. If you have a problem bleeding an ABS car that's unpowered. The earlier Cavaliers came with this old school ABS system that's integrated into the master cylinder. And the best thing to do if you've got that system is to throw that straight in the garbage and then go and grab one from the junkyard off of a newer car. It's very annoying to work with and very difficult to find replacement parts for. just get this set up. It's the best one. You've got your left side lines, so you've got left rear, left front. You've got your right lines, right front, right rear, and they are staggered opposite of each other. Your left side lines are M6 by 1.0 bubble flare, like everything else on the car. Your right side lines are actually M10 by 1.5. I just realized I said M6 earlier. Everything is M10 on this car. If I've said M6, I'm completely wrong with that. It's M10. So M10 by 1.0 for everything else on the car. These two fittings right here specifically for the right side at the block, M10 by 1.5. So if you need to find a line nut for it, that's the size you need to go there. I usually just cut those lines, the factory lines off, and then I'll pull the nut off the line, wire wheel it up on the bench grinder, and then slap it back on whatever line I end up making, which will be this line because it obviously has M6 by 1.0 on both ends. I'll get started on that project. All right, I got the old line ripped out. Let's see. Right there's where she got smashed. I've got my new line here. I've torn the tag off the other end and I've shoved the nut past it, left a little bit of the tag on there so that this nut won't slide back down the line. The reason I did that is because if you're manipulating this line in place and that nut slides all the way down to the other end and then you get the whole damn thing bent up, and both nuts are down here together, it's a wasted endeavor. You'll have to unbend it to slide the nut back to the other end or cut it and reflare it. So before you start hand bending this thing and you don't plan on cutting it, tape the nuts to either end or just do it the lazy way like I did. Shove it past that label. So now I'm going to look down where I want it to run, and it'll be on the steering rack side. And I'm literally just going to poke it down through that area. Perfect. See how much of this I can do one-handed. I'm going to guess about that much. We're going to bend it sort of towards that. All right, we've already started. What I'm going to do here real quick, put the phone down, and I'm going to bend this line up and start the video again after that part's done because I need two hands for that. All right. As you can see, I tighten that nut down into the brake hose. I have a little 90 going this way, and then it's following the bottom of the frame rail, and then I'm just bending it down behind this part of the K-frame here. So now it's completely away from wherever the axle can attempt to destroy it. It comes up this side, hugs that frame rail, and then kind of has to jog around that flat piece, which is kind of janky, but I don't have another plan for that yet. So I'm just going to do it like that and then see what happens. So it's going to run up the firewall here, and then I'm going to shoot it across like I did the other line. Set this little tripod up here. See if this works. So a trick for bending this NICOP line well. If you have a glass bottle, like a beer bottle, or I've got this little shot glass that we got in Gatlinburg. Kelly's probably going to kill me when she sees me using it. It has the threads on it there, and it's a nice little groove to set the line in to bend this stuff. And the reason you want that is you want to keep the line uniform as you bend it, otherwise it'll flatten out and form a kink. I figure about where I want to bend it. We're in here. And then what you want to do is hold one side against the jar and then pull the line through the threads. Get yourself a nice 90-degree bend there. You can see I've got a little hole drilled there. I had electrical P-clamps holding this line to the firewall. And I am going to put those back in the same spot. I'm going to slap a couple clamps on before I finish bending the rest of this line. So I will stop this video and start it again. All right, this is what we got going on. I put a P-clamp and a rivet right there, just behind the strut. Keep it away from as many moving things as I can. And then everything else was where it was clamped before. There's one down there near the strut tower, one right here, and then it just kind of follows the contour. I got them every 6 inches or so. I get these P-clamps off of Amazon. I don't know if any of this will be useful, but wow, now. So this is what they are. It's just a little strip of plastic with some holes in it. And you can see why they're called P-clamps. This is what they normally look like. Well, this is the more industrial size. I'll use these throughout the car to run wire loom that I don't want to move around. And these little cheapy ones I get are 3/16, and the rivets that, if you own a race car, you have to be familiar with rivets by now, are perfect for locking down. The hole on them is already the right size to get yourself some of those little plastic P-clamps. There were metal ones, but I figured the plastic ones would be less abrasive against the line when it's vibrating and all that kind of stuff. There are rubber coated ones too, but still, I think the plastic one's the way to go. So I got my line over here, and I actually need to cut this line off because that's M10 by 1.0, and I need to use the M10 by 1.5 nut for that wheel. So I am going to cut and flare this line. Use a tubing cutter. They exist for a reason, and they make a nice uniform flat cut. I am not. I am using my whiz wheel. I'll say this because I've heard it more times in my life than I care to admit. Something a grandparent said to me once: follow what I say, not what I've done. Let's see if I can get a good angle of this. Okay, I don't need that nut. What I'm going to do now is make sure that that line is grinded square, nice and flat. If you use a tubing cutter, it'll pretty much already be flat. That's not too bad. The next thing I'm going to do is run a little drill bit through it, because that whiz wheel will create some burrs. This is like a, I think, let me look, 9/64. Yeah, it's a 9/64 drill bit. I think it's the closest thing I had laying around because I have destroyed all of my little drill bits. But that will deburr the inside of that line and make it back the diameter that it's supposed to be. And then I will run some emery cloth over the edge of it to deburr it. Not too bad. And then the most important part, put the nut on the line before you flare it. That gets missed more times than it should. The next thing I'm going to do is flare it, and I need to make a bubble flare. And you can rent a double flaring tool from any part store, or you can just buy one, or you can rent it and never give it back and have one with a nice plastic case in it. Couple options here. So when you're using this tool, you'll have this little piece for making the double flare, and this initially creates a bubble flare. And see how I can do this. I don't know if I'm going to be able to. Well, the amount of line that sticks out of this part of the flaring tool is determined by the little step down in the gap there. So you'll set this against the clamp and then push the line out of the clamp until it touches the bottom of like that little ledge there. If this makes any sense. That's how far out it needs to stick when you clamp this thing in to make a correct bubble flare. I'm gonna attempt to do that right now. We may end up making this a time lapse because I might screw it up 6 or 7 times. Okay, clamped in there. Doesn't have to be crazy tight. You've got the little pin, and then you've got the concave part. You put the little pin in the line, and then you take your whatever this part is. All right. Shit. Okay. So what you want to do is slowly tighten this down until it touches that little circle piece that you put in there. And then you want to make sure that everything is lining up straight. If it's all cocked off to an angle, it's going to create a crooked bend and everything will look like crap. So everything's nice and straight. Now you're just going to crank it down until that little adapter piece in there touches the clamp part. This stuff is really soft line, so it'll be real easy to compress it down. I might have to get a little screwdriver to pop that out. There it is, a bubble flare. All right, line is made, line is tight. I'll go over everything once the line's in place and make sure that the line isn't loose anywhere. And if it is, I'll put a P-clamp on it. Or if I can't put a clamp there, just make sure that the line can't vibrate against any piece of metal. All that's left for me is to bleed it. And I have this little vacuum operated, goes to my air compressor, power bleeder, so I can do these solo. Got that from Harbor Freight. Another great purchase from Harbor Freight if you work on cars regularly. See the fluid. It pulled a little bit through. That was probably what was in the caliper already. So I'll keep going until it's a steady stream. Great. Once you got a pretty steady stream of fluid coming through, close it off. And then I would normally do one more go of traditional bleeding after doing that. It's probably fine right now, but I'm going to make sure that your reservoir did not run empty while you were doing that. Because if you suck that thing dry, you just pulled a bunch of air back into the line. But I can call that project done. Got the brakes fixed on this car. My axle should be here sometime this week. And probably start working on fixing the front bumper on this thing tomorrow. But not bad progress for a day. See you in the next update.